Hello and welcome to this LinkedIn Live session hosted by SSON and Everest Group. My name is Barbara Hodge. I'm the global editor of SSON, and I'm pleased to see so many of you here for this very important conversation. Please do take an interactive approach via the chat today, and maybe you can start by telling us where you are tuning in from. I'm in Northern Italy myself. There's no need to explain why we are meeting on this important topic today. The world has been watching events in Ukraine unfold for weeks, and the enormity of the humanitarian crisis leaves all of us affected. At the same time, we're only too aware of how closely this industry, namely business services, is directly impacted through staff, families, and operations. Thousands of people work in service delivery across Ukraine, Poland, and also Russia. It means that organizations across the world are directly feeling the impact of this crisis on their workforce. And that's why having this call is so important today. Let me introduce our participants. You will already know the excellent research work of Everest Group in IT, business process, and engineering services and technologies that power those processes. Many of you, in fact, already rely on this expertise to make critical and strategic decisions. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Eric Simonson, Managing Partner of the research organization at Everest Group, whose focus is on global delivery and talent models. We also have Julian Herbert, VP of Information Products, who leads Everest Group's benchmarking in Europe and maintains strong relationships with clients. I'm also pleased to introduce Deborah Kops. Deborah is the founder of Sourcing Change, which helps GBS organizations connect strategy, model, organization, and talent to deliver transformation. She's been an industry observer and GBS advisor for many years, focusing on the number one imperative, talent. And finally, I'm really pleased to introduce Janusz Jurdzinski, Global Information and Digital Technology Manager at BAT, based in Warsaw, Poland. Janusz is also a founder and current president of the management board of ABSL, which represents the business services industry in Poland, an industry that employs more than 300,000 people. Before we start, I encourage all of you to take part in this conversation. Use the chat, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen, to comment and ask questions, and we'll weave these questions in where we can. So let's start. We are facing first and foremost a humanitarian crisis and tragedy. Well over 1 million people have already fled Ukraine into neighboring Poland and other countries. It's been reported that all refugees coming into Poland have in fact been taken in by families and are living in homes. But the outpouring of support doesn't make up for the enormous personal loss and the stress which will only increase given loved ones left behind, lack of money, and eventually perhaps also the stress on host families. Janusz, you're based in Poland, you're heavily involved in the business services sector, and of course, you're MD of BAT's Polish Services Center. Could you give us an idea what you've been facing for the last few weeks?
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everyone. A pleasure to be with you. As we chatted before we started, it's a good thing to reflect back and talk rather than being deeply rooted in the daily drill. What is happening over the course of last 2 weeks is, I'm trying to find the right word, is completely unprecedented, completely unprecedented. And it has so many different facets. But I will start with the fact that given the dramatic situation we are in, the values that our companies, the values that the industry, the values that all of us professionals play out these days is stronger than ever. And the whole notion of respect, diversity, and inclusion of every single individual, regardless of nationality, that's very important, is super strong, stronger than ever. What I've seen, what I've witnessed over the course of last 2 weeks is exceeded my all expectations. The amount of help, the open hearts, the people queuing to help, people dropping everything to drive to the border and give lifts, offering their apartments, providing all kind of possible help, shelter, food, first aid is unspeakable, right? I just cannot express what is happening. Many people take, as you mentioned correctly, unknowns, complete foreigners under the roof, without knowing for how long it's going to last, without expectation of any help from anyone, rather than offering do what is the right thing to do. This includes people, this includes companies, etc. However, I want to mention one very important thing. Right, I can give you many examples, but there is one thing I want to stress here. We are doing what needs to be done in these first weeks. This is not gonna end up within weeks. And even if significant majority of refugees really trust and really hope and express their willingness to come back as soon as possible, believe this, they are talking days. Of course, that's impossible, okay? So while they want to come back and pretty much long for their homes, for the beloved ones, it's not going to end up as quickly. So what we need to do right now as professionals, as companies, beyond being humans only, is to make sure that longer term, we can really provide a sustained and well-organized structure to help. What I mean is the citizenship, work permit, schooling, health insurance, financial help, organized financial help. This is what I'm talking about, right? And very happy to say that the Polish government yesterday night introduced a completely new regulation, which makes all of this significantly easier, including financial help for all refugees and all those who are helping them. And again, I'll be happy to chip in with many more examples of how ABSL and how, for example, my company is helping. But you can imagine what that spans. It starts from information, it goes through legal advisory, advocacy assistant, but it also ends up in charity support, fundraising, and very well organized help, including giving up our offices for shelter of people.
I mean, the world has been watching, Janusz. I think we've all been just incredibly moved by the efforts made by organizations such as ABSL and BAT and many more. And I know it's spilling over, not just Poland, it's spilling over into Austria. I have friends who are taking in refugees. Let's pivot a little. I mean, the crisis impacts service delivery models very strongly, right? Because countries in Eastern Europe have long been seen as a great location to place many of these services. And in fact, many of you logging in today represent delivery centers that have been directly impacted by the war in Eastern Ukraine, or perhaps from the perspective of neighboring countries who are suffering from the stress of seeing colleagues displaced. Julian, maybe I can pivot this to you. What does this mean in terms of actual business operations in the Ukraine and the region? What do you foresee based on the research you've been doing?
Sure, thanks, Barbara. So I guess half a dozen really quick points. The first thing I think we have to remember is that Ukraine is kind of divided at the moment into two regions. You've got Area 1, I suppose, to the north of Kiev and to the east and south of the Dnieper River, and Area 2, all points west to the Polish, Slovakian, Hungarian, Moldovan, Romanian borders. And that includes Vinnytsia, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Chernovitzy. So two distinct areas. And in Area 1, that first area north of Kiev into the east, delivery is significantly, if not entirely, significantly disrupted, if not entirely halted, as far as we understand it. Area 2, some delivery seems to still be ongoing, and some resources from central and eastern Ukraine have relocated to points west and to Poland, Romania, Hungary, and to points even further west, as we've just been hearing. And enterprises that we have spoken to indicate they have executed pretty well rehearsed business continuity plans and moved service delivery, in some cases, out of Ukraine entirely. Probably worth remembering that Ukraine-based people, and this is all about people, account for about 10% of the total European service delivery workforce. And the majority of that would be in Kiev, but since 2014, I think what we've seen is a growing percentage of this workforce is based in that Area 2 that I spoke about, Lviv, Vinnytsia, and Ivano-Frankivsk. Interesting snippet I heard on the BBC the other day, an interview with a CEO of Lviv IT cluster, Stepan Veselovsky. He was talking a little bit about service delivery and confirmed that there had been this west migration tech talent, and that internet and electricity supply remain. They were certainly last weekend remaining fairly stable, and that some service delivery is still continuing. Now, he also made quite an important point, and that is that service delivery is not really the priority for this group of people that have migrated east. The tech community seems to be engaged in the national effort, and part of that includes the detection and prevention of cyber attacks. But of course, there is still a little bit of service delivery happening from inside Ukraine, but most of it now has migrated elsewhere. Worth, I think, commenting on cyber. Cyber monitoring seems to have stepped up significantly, and preparedness for cyber attacks has anyway been heightened, and there doesn't really appear yet to have been many successful ones, at least directed at service delivery in that in that area too, in the eastern part of the country. Comment on Russia, I suppose, worth reminding everyone too that aside from the Ukraine, organisations who were delivering services from Russia are facing really significant distractions and pressures amongst their people. Those are financial pressures, of course, because the financial systems aren't there to pay them. Dramatic increases in mortgage payments with the hike in interest rates, combined with all of the usual uncertainties that would accompany this type of horror, emotional burdens, and so on and so forth. And as a final aside, of course, no reasonable country ever wants to profit from the misery that is being inflicted on Ukraine. But the reality is that with the EU, and Janusz, I'm sure, can comment on this, on countries granting Ukrainians an automatic right to stay and work. The EU has done that for people with documents for 3 years. Displaced Ukrainians will be able to contribute economically to their host countries. And I think also Janusz will be able to comment on what's happened with employees, Ukrainian citizens who are employed in Poland and elsewhere, what's happened to them and whether they have gone back to the Ukraine to help with the national effort in the Ukraine. So that kind of wraps it up, really. Just worth remembering that it's 10% of about 1 million people engaged in service delivery from Ukraine prior to the conflict.
Huge numbers. Janusz, Julian mentioned, a couple of issues that relate to Poland. Is there anything you want to comment on or add?
I would probably, thank you, Barbara. What I would add to Julian is 10% is from Ukraine, but remember, out of over 350,000 people employed in that sector in Poland, more than 20% of foreigners are Ukrainians. They are by far the number one group, and they significantly contribute to the sector growth and development, which has been unprecedented over the course of last 10-15 years, and it continues to grow. What Julian mentioned about exodus, it's factual. It's estimated that in general around 250,000 people, mainly men, decided to go back to basically attend what is their national call, and which basically leaves void for anybody. I'm not talking about our sector. This is across the board. At the same time, all of these people who are coming in, they of course will need work, and our sector has proven over the course of many years that we were very welcome, very diverse, and very much inclusive and welcoming anyone who would like to grow professionally and personally. So totally agree. When it comes to allowances, as I correctly mentioned here, the formal regulation voted by the Polish Parliament last night gives very broad privileges and provides lots of help, eases the bureaucracy and eases all the processes, and basically gives anything and everything possible to those who had to flee to settle down here. Having said that, coming back to your initial question, Barbara, it's much easier said than done.
Yeah, absolutely. Deborah, let me put this over to you for a moment. So we've heard from Julian, about the economic let's call them the economic drivers that are impacting the region at the moment. But you work very closely with lots of GBS heads, and you understand what the model leaders are looking for. What do you foresee, not in the short term now, it's not the time for that, but what do you foresee us doing in terms, or the shifts in terms of perhaps workforce issues?
Well, I'd like to take it back to now, because the GBS leaders that I'm in touch with right now are finding that their biggest challenge is not humanitarian aid. Their companies have come to the table. Is it enough? Is it soon enough? That's another issue. But I think we've all been on LinkedIn and seen a lot of banners of organizations who are contributing $1 million, $5 million, etc. I think what I've heard is the challenge is communication. Most multinationals now are in crisis mode. In some cases, they don't know what to say. They're making it up every day. We've just come off of a pandemic with a certain rhythm of crisis communication. Now we have a completely new one. And I think bringing up the region, Russia, one of the challenges that I've heard facing GBS leaders with any kind of operation in Russia is that they're very concerned not only what they communicate or whether they should even communicate, because of the worry that a communication from the West is going to be an impairment for them. So what I see right now are GBS and corporate crisis management teams making it up every day. It's not something we didn't envision, or perhaps we weren't sensitive enough to read the tea leaves. We didn't see the need to deal with the business implications from an armed conflict.
Yeah.
So I think short term, that's a huge issue. Longer term, I think we're in a period right now where organizations are first and foremost, as you said at the top of the discussion, focused on the impact of their people. There have been sufficient BCP plans in place to move work around. And I don't hear anything about not being able, we haven't had a month-end close yet, to be very honest, but not being able to support the organization. What I foresee is that as this situation lasts or rages on, that another muscle will come into play, and the focus will shift to ways of working. Not only how do we support these teams, how do we deal with productivity, what other decisions do we need to make at this point?
Yeah. I think, Eric, let me switch over to you for a moment. Let's talk from the service delivery model perspective, because again, this is what connects all of us. And by the way, anyone tuning in today, please do tell us what you are doing at the moment in terms of helping your employees or in terms of rerouting work that has been interrupted. We'd love to hear from you. But Eric, picking up from Deborah's comments, we've had now COVID for 2 years. Automation had been breaking the mold for a decade. And now we have this enormous geopolitical disaster with very far-reaching consequences. How do you imagine multinationals might consider or reconsider their service delivery models in light of this experience? And I'm thinking specifically in terms of preserving capacity, setting priorities, or perhaps even new options, considering the risk profiles, Eric.
Okay, great, thanks. And so we'd put down a few thoughts on this that we'll kind of use to anchor this. And what I'll go back to is something that I think has been implied in all of the comments thus far, which is, although many things have happened, it's clear not everything that will happen has happened. And so there's a chessboard of things where both new decisions may be taken, but also the implication of decisions like refugees leaving, being hosted with families, et cetera. There will be more implications that we can't fully appreciate at this point. So that's sort of the lens for this, to be thinking about how do we maybe start to do or consider things now that may help in the future. So the first sort of vector that I think is important to make sure is carefully considered is simply that because of this uncertainty and the need for change, there's going to be a lot of demands. There may also be supply of labor that is short. And so being able to preserve capacity can be critical to kind of weathering through that. I think the first thing, Deborah spoke about this, really understanding what's happening with the domestic business for Russia, Ukraine, and are those needs changing? That may help provide capacity, or it may actually consume capacity. There are also things like looking at the level of performance, the extent to which you're working complex exceptions. There'll be ways to try to back off of some of that, or prepare for how you may do that should you need to create some capacity. Most organizations, beginning of the year, you have a whole bunch of initiatives. You're going to change the world. You have to finish the plan. You have the budgets. Maybe a good time to reconsider some of those initiatives. Really think about which ones could be done maybe differently, delayed, connected up differently. So kind of culling and prioritizing initiatives so that the stops and starts can be to be eased. Beyond these sort of ideas on how to make preserve capacity, there's also, so what are the options of if just sort of taking the foot off the gas isn't enough? I think we suggest people start thinking about to identify, first, really understanding the work from the standpoint of what are the skills and processes that you have in different delivery models that could be impacted, and under what scenarios would those exposures start to become concerning. It's also, many organizations don't tend to look at their service delivery portfolio in a very integrated way. Increasingly, organizations are trying to do that, but it's still often what's outsourced here or delivered here isn't completely understood how they may fit. So trying to understand alternatives. If work did need to be moved, or you need to create some redundancies in BCP, it's a time to think maybe a little bit more creatively than say like COVID may have forced. And then final point is, there may be some interesting positive factors that could be wins for everyone in terms of helping refugees find employment that could help on the shortages of supply, helping create some economics for a bunch of different people. And so staying abreast of that can maybe trigger some ideas and what sort of work may be amenable for those. Some organizations have delivery operations both in the Ukraine and in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and how they may rebalance and rejigger some of that work is an important thing to consider. And then finally, if people are needing to take more aggressive motions to think about how to work through this, one of the first things is, money is what makes the world go round. And when you're trying to make decisions quickly, if you know where the checkbook is, what are the decision rights, how can you actually, what degrees of freedom you have, is important, and can start to get a little bit of a playbook together on that. Maybe a good time to run some work in kind of a split or redundant. It's a lot easier to scale up something that already exists than it is to start something from nothing. There may be situations where the existing service providers, and maybe in someone's portfolio, can help on maybe some things if necessary, but not everything. So maybe think about other new providers to contemplate as alternatives to help diversify work, create fallback. And then finally, if you are working with a set of service providers, to what extent could you transition work between them? What would be their posture on that? What tools or capabilities may they have, and how would that actually work if the need should eventually arise? So those are a few of the things, are kind of some thought starters on this to maybe be preparing when we're not yet in kind of broadly challenging situations. So.
Deborah, I have the feeling you might have some thoughts on that. We did also have a question from the audience, and please do keep them coming. How are companies invoking BCP, business continuity planning? And could there be, this particular person is in India, how might hiring be impacted, or how might centers be expanded? I guess the question is really, are we concerned about regional risk profiles to the extent that we might try and pivot what we've been used to for a long time, certain countries as nearshore for big markets. I mean, everywhere has a risk profile, but Deborah, if I could just throw that over to you.
Yeah, I think we already had the ability to pivot work. I think that muscle is already in play. I think if the question implied here is, are we looking to make more permanent decisions about how work is done, where work is done? It's still early days. I don't see much energy put into the whole issue. I mean, yes, there's concern about the region. I don't think we should sugarcoat the fact that there isn't. But I think the lot of the BCP practices that were put in place for COVID are holding up.
Absolutely.
We had a 2-year rehearsal for this. Janusz, you've seen it. I mean, you knew when you were working, you weren't working. When countries were shutting down, COVID was nasty, but there's a difference between a virus and a gun. Let's call it what it is.
No, of course, Deborah. This is spot on. I think that's nicely said. We had unbelievable rehearsal. I'll just remind you, when the COVID kicked in, the significant majority, exactly 80% of all the job, and I'm talking about business services in Poland, according to ABSL data, 78 to be very precise, 78% of all the jobs and all the work has been revoked to work remotely from home within 72 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is BCP, okay? So
right.
This sector and ability to pivot into the BCP is something that we have practiced extensively.
Mm-hmm.
If you, of course, you cannot compare one the other. This is a different story. However, if you see the significance of impact that COVID had over the course of last 2 years, it's immense. Okay, we kind of move from one to the other, and one, in fact, we have two to deal with. But this is not. I would agree. This is not something that. This is not a situation in which we need to make abrupt decisions. Right? It's more like, stick to what we know the best, support all the people, and plan for coming weeks and months, but don't lose patience and don't lose strategic thinking in all of this. And by the way, if you wonder, the world moves on. It is on Tuesday this week that Google announced 2.33 billion PLN, which is $700 million investment into Warsaw in Poland, to build and to strengthen their position. And this comes on the Canva on all the developments that we have. So the business moves on, and there will be more investments like that. Ironically, this whole horrific situation might call for much more bolder moves from many companies around the world. So I would stay tight, continue doing what we're doing, which is the message that everybody gives to their employees. The best thing you do is to, of course, help, but don't be too much concerned. Don't listen to the news. Don't get traumatic. Stick to what we do. Deliver the business. Move on. Right. This is the best thing we can do, without forgetting, of course, and with all the help that I mentioned at the beginning, that we all mentioned in the beginning, because that goes without saying. But this is too early. I would agree to make quick movements.
Yeah, I think where there is an opportunity right now is to start to look at capabilities, because and ensure that there's redundancy of capability in the system. But wholesale changes in a delivery model right now won't see it. Won't see it in the short term.
Yeah. I think to Deborah, to your point before about, BCP and the plans already being there, and Janusz said the same, we've been talking over the last 3-4 years about digital GBS, shared services, virtual operations. I think one of you before made the point or asked the question, how flexible are we really? And, the point is, in theory, I think this service delivery model should be entirely flexible. But I guess, what I'm seeing and hearing a lot is the truth is we are very heavily anchored in people, large numbers of people still in locations. And Eric, maybe you could comment on this. That's not an easy model. It's not as agile as perhaps it could be.
Yeah, so I think, so when the COVID helped some on this, because I think the reality is anytime you have to change up the way you're working, it stresses the system a bit and reveals assumptions that you didn't know you'd made, and you have to come up with that. A lot of the automation initiatives have also revealed yes, we had a standard process, but sometimes standard isn't as standard as one might think. So the in terms of being able to move work around, I think many of the things you think about that are being able to create fungibility and resource within a center, induct new hires faster, some of those same thought processes, documentation, supporting help within how technology may assist the work, those wrappers around to create commonality of process, even though some underlying systems may be different. Those things just take on another level of importance when you're trying to deal with uncertainty and potentially a need for extra capacity. Actually, we had been focusing a lot on just basically the talent shortages, and if you look at the demographics globally, things are we're sort of creating more work than we're creating people. Many of those same things now manifest in the form of another crisis of how do we allow humans to perform at their maximum and not waste the effort of humans on things that maybe are nice, but they're too bundled into legacy expertise that isn't really sustainable in the long term anyway.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's probably the time for today. It's been an incredibly important, I believe, discussion, and I thank everyone. Janusz, we wish you well and your extended teams, employees, and everything that ABSL is doing. I think you had mentioned when we chatted earlier, you may have some links to support networks that we could share via LinkedIn with anyone who would like them. Is that something that you could perhaps share with us later and we can put it up on LinkedIn?
Of course, and the easiest thing you can do anyway is to go straight to the ABSL site. It's easy, absl.pl. You have abundance of information over there, including of the positions and all the information hub. I mean, we mentioned before, very rightly so, information and communication it's super important and can be extremely difficult. So it is. So if we don't do anything else, just go to the site, have a look at what's happening. It's you're going to find lots of links there.
Thank you very much, Janusz. And I want to thank, obviously, the team from Everest for presenting the data. And I know that you're doing lots of research as we speak, covering globally, but very much looking at the region and what it means. And of course, Deborah, a big thank you to you. Deborah represents the Global Advisory Board on SSON, and we are constantly trying to stay ahead of the game and provide information on whatever's happening in the market to support anyone involved with service delivery. So thank you to all of you. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Please do stay connected with us on LinkedIn. And if there are any questions we haven't addressed, please post them to each of us on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.
Stay strong.
Stay strong. Stay strong.